So let's go straight into red teaming, because I think that's what you're all here for. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm a red team operator at the Northwave Red Team. I have a background as a network engineer, but that's because I love networks and I also love hacking them. I'm also specialized in social engineering, which, as you can imagine, plays a pretty big role in red teaming engagements. And all of these skill sets have helped me to become a red team operator. So let's talk about red teaming. First, I would like to talk about the term red teaming, because I feel like this is a very misunderstood term. It's been used by many people in a lot of different ways. So with red teaming, we mostly refer to adversary simulation. So the most important part about red teaming is simulating an adversary, which means we are reproducing the steps that an adversary would take in a network so that the organization can learn how to better protect against these attacks. The second point is to challenge the defenses that are already in place. Normally, organizations first do some vulnerability assessments, penetration tests. They get their stuff in order, and then they want to test their defenses. The third thing is to measure the effectiveness of these defenses. If the segmentation that you've implemented, is it sufficient to protect your crown jewels, for example? And then it's also important to test the incident response processes. What are the defenders going to do once they find an attacker in the network? Are they going to have some effective measures to kick them out? So all of this has changed over the years, as you can imagine. And the meaning of the term red teaming has also changed throughout the years. So the concept of red teaming has changed, and it has started out from the 1960s. So after the Cold War, the US military figured out that they need to challenge their own techniques and defenses. And they found out that by missing the role of an adversary in their simulations, they were unable to predict some of the challenges they're going to face. So that's why they coined the term red teaming, and in this case, the red represented the Soviet Union, and basically they used this to practice various things. For example, they practiced negotiating an arms treaty and see how this could be subverted. And then in the 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israel formed the Ipcha Mistabra, which was an organization which was formed purely to do contrarian thinking. So they were supposed to challenge conventional thinking. They were supposed to challenge the status quo, and in this way find out some things that could be overlooked. In the 2000s, there was a very impactful event that basically changed a lot of the things, one of which was airport security, and that's, of course, 9/11. And the CIA formed a red cell, which was supposed to practice adversary simulations for threat actors. And this is the first thing that starts to resemble red teaming as we use the term today. And the present-day red teaming is not used only in the military and the cyber security industries. A lot of industries use this term to represent contrarian thinking, basically challenging already established ideas and concepts to make them better and find flaws in them. So, red teaming is about simulating an adversary, which means that it's important to understand the role of an adversary, and also how do these techniques help defenders combat adversaries. So it is a lot of things to consider in mind. And not only that, different threat actors have different modus operandi, different techniques that they're using, different behaviors. And by modeling one of them, you are not modeling every single behavior. You are modeling a very specific threat actor. And for example, an insider threat is something very similar from a supply chain attack. Then phishing attacks could be very different from physical attack vectors. So there's many threat actors that many organizations would love to learn to defend against. However, organizations understandably have limited budgets, and then they choose to focus on what bothers them the most. And that is advanced persistent threats, also known as APTs, and often the term threat actor refers to some kind of APT. This is also a term that has been coined by the US military, and it was coined initially in 2006. It's almost always used to refer to an adversary, which has long-term persistent goals in achieving access within a network and attaining access to some objectives, some crown jewels, exfiltrating information, and so forth, depending on of course, the profile of the attacker. And APTs can be associated with any faction. A lot of the APTs that we know today are associated with China, with Russia, with Iran. However, there's also APTs that are associated with the US, for example, and also Israel, North Korea, and so forth. So the APT landscape is quite complex. And you can see that if you take a look at some threat intel feeds. For example, on dark reading, if you look it up right now, there's a lot of stories about events that happened in the recent past. And a lot of them are quite complex. A lot of attacks, SIM swapping, social engineering, phishing, so everything happens. But it wasn't always like this. Back then, the threat landscape was very different. So, let's go back in time. Not that far back in time, although you could say that the dinosaurs were some pretty rough threat actors. We're going back to 1999. Moonlight Maze. So this is the first threat actor that was deemed an advanced persistent threat. So this was a very impactful event. Basically what happened is there was a massive data breach of classified information in the US. And US government investigation showed that the threat actor was active for 3 years. So the attack started somewhere in 1996, but the first investigations showed up in the public in 1999. So it was impacting the NASA, Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and so forth. It has been attributed to Russia. However, Russia understandably has always denied these claims. It was said that if all of the information that was compromised during this attack was to be printed out and stacked on top of one another, it would reach a height 3 times of the Washington Monument. That is a lot of compromised data. And as you can imagine, this was quite impactful. What were the modus operandi? What were the techniques that this threat actor was using? First of all, they searched for systems that were associated with their targets. They enumerated the network address space. Then they scanned these systems for vulnerabilities. They exploited vulnerabilities in these systems. They deployed backdoors through which they could access these systems at any time. And then they gathered and exfiltrated the information through 3 years before they were discovered. Next, Titan Rain in 2006. So this was a series of attacks that were targeting the US Department of Defense, defense contractors, and UK ministries as well. They had higher sophistication than the previous known APT attacks. And this was mostly because they learned. So the defenders figured out that we have to patch all these vulnerabilities in our systems. They're not just abstract, they're actually abusable and they can be used against us. And the Titan Rain APT, which is assumed to be associated with China, however, China never actually admitted this, understandable, they were actually using social engineering for initial access. So there is already a difference between this threat actor and the previous one, because these threat actors had to first get into an internal network. So the perimeter was, we assume, more or less safe. They had pretty good operational security, and they were active for 3 years, as far as we know, but it could be a bit longer than that. So what they did is first they social engineered targets into running a Trojan. They backdoored the system, they gathered and exfiltrated data, and then they scanned the network for new targets and vulnerabilities and repeated all over. So there's some speculation that there was a worm called a MyFib, which was basically used in this attack. However, the OPSEC profile does not match with what was written in the reports, so there's no confirmation that this was actually a worm at hand. It could have also been manual actions. Then in 2009, GhostNet. This was a large-scale espionage campaign that basically affected 1,295 systems in 103 countries. So this one had a pretty wide impact. It's one of the more popular threat actors out there, also associated with China. They never admitted it. And they targeted the ministries, non-governmental organizations, news medias, and so forth. And their operational security was better than the previous ones. It started out when the Tibetan embassy had been compromised, and this is why it was assumed to be associated with China, along with some other indicators of compromise. However, as I said, never confirmed. What they did is they social engineered targets into accessing a document or link, and then the document or the web page would exploit a vulnerability in Internet Explorer. It would then backdoor the system, scan the network for new targets and exploit vulnerabilities in these new targets, and then gather and exfiltrate data. And one more threat actor. This one is maybe something you heard of, Operation Aurora. So it was a series of attacks that, once again, targeted US private sector companies in this case, unlike the previous APTs that were targeting governments and ministries and similar. And in this case, the objective was trade secrets, so competitive advantage. And they focused on access to source code. And this is an operation in which we see the use of 0 days, of previously unknown vulnerabilities that were exploited to target people. So, targets were social engineered into opening a document or link. Then the document would exploit a vulnerability in Internet Explorer again. And if you ever wondered about Internet Explorer's reputation, how it happened, I think it's pretty clear. It was MS-10002. The exploit, if you're wondering. And after the exploit succeeded, the system would be backdoored, and then they would gather and exfiltrate data. So what do all of these APTs have in common? Espionage. So all of these threat actors are focused on espionage, and that means that they have to stay stealthy. They have to take it slow, don't do anything out of the ordinary, well, for the ordinary, of course, of today, and back then is different, and ensure that you don't raise any suspicion. And even then, in this, let's say, decade that I went through, you can already see a difference in the modus operandi of the threat actors. So the earliest threat actors in Moonlight Maze, they just exploited unpatched vulnerabilities directly and backdoored and exfiltrated data immediately. However, later on, they actually have to social engineer, they have to use 0 days, they have to be a lot more careful in comparison. So we already see a shift in the security maturity of the organizations that were being targeted. The truth is that all of these techniques that these threat actors have been using back then, they're not really applicable today. So if I am asked to simulate one of these threat actors from these examples, this would not play out the same way. It would be very different. Now, there are some industries that have some specific, let's say, threat profiles, and there's very specific attacks that happen in these industries. And definitely the energy industry is one that gets targeted often. Stuxnet being a famous example of a worm that was targeting Iran uranium enrichment facilities. Then the Night Dragon attacks, which were on general security, energy companies throughout the world. Shamoon, the malware which was targeting oil companies in the Middle East. And Black Energy, which was targeting infrastructure for energy in Ukraine. There was one event happening shortly after, however, that changed the threat landscape for many organizations. CryptoLocker. I hope that none of you ever had to deal with this problem. This is the first big problem of ransomware. So it's not the first ransomware out there. There were some other ransomware samples out there. However, the problem here was this one was delivered by a botnet. So instead of infecting one by one, people were using basically botnets, maybe getting access to a lot of systems by botnets, and then deploying the ransomware en masse. And after the popularity of CryptoLocker, I guess a lot of threat actors got very inspired. And then they massively started focusing on ransomware instead. And that's when we got other ransomware strains, for example, CryptoWall and Petya. However, the one that changed the game in general and the threat model for many organizations was WannaCry. And I would say that it's a very fitting name. So let's take a look at what happened with WannaCry. In 2017, in April, the Eternal Blue exploit leaked from the NSA thanks to the Shadow Brokers group. Now, I think most pen testers and red teamers were celebrating at this day because that meant you get immediate domain admin access to pretty much every network you're in. However, threat actors felt the same, and that's not a good thing. So it only took a month for this exploit to be weaponized into a worm. And it was, of course, a worm that was delivering ransomware. And there were quite a few high-profile cases which, let's say, came as a result of this activity. And more than 300,000 systems were compromised with this ransomware. The damage was estimated around 4 billion. Another very similar example was NotPetya, which happened very shortly after the WannaCry problem. And NotPetya basically was also weaponizing Eternal Blue, and it caused damage of around 10 billion. So the reason why this was so impactful is because many organizations, once all of these news started hitting the news outlets, many organizations started asking themselves, am I vulnerable as well to these threat actors? Can I be also compromised like this? So this changed their threat model from espionage, where they were worrying about their intellectual property from being stolen and given to their competitors, to actually protecting the availability of their systems and being able to ensure business continuity. However, it didn't only change the organization's threat models. It also changed the focus from ransomware operators from espionage to ransomware operations. So the problem is that the threat actors that are basically into ransomware have very different modus operandi from the espionage-focused threat actors. Where if you want to spy on a network, you have to stay stealthy, right? You have to make sure that you are not raising any suspicion that the blue team is not seeing you. However, ransomware operators do not really care about this. Ransomware operators just power through a network for as fast as they can, and that means that their approach is very different. They're not very focused on stealth at all. They are reckless. They don't care if they cause damage to your network. They don't care if any of your critical business functions go down. So how does this look? Well, I think phishing has been an eternal classic. So phishing has been, and I guess for the foreseeable future, is still going to remain relevant. However, not all threat actors have the skills these days to pull off phishing. And this is why, and this is because Microsoft has invested a lot into mitigating initial access possibilities. Let's take a look at what are the mitigations that Microsoft implemented to mitigate basically phishing. First of all, mark of the web. With mark of the web, any content that is delivered through the internet is marked as untrustworthy. So this content is treated differently, is scrutinized a lot by EDRs, it may be restrained, which means that for a threat actor to get access through phishing, they would have to bypass these problems that come with their content being marked with the mark of the web. Then we have safe links. So with emails being a classic medium of delivering malware, you have to have either an attachment or a link. Now, attachments used to be quite popular back in the days, and then the focus switched to links. However, safe links also helped defenders against this because there came out reputation systems, for example, and scanners that were evaluating the content of the URL before the user was allowed to access the content. So whenever you receive an email in Outlook and you click the email there, it will be rewritten with safe links, checked for reputation, checked for the content that's on the website, and then, if that's deemed safe, only then you will get to see the content. Then, Windows Defender Application Control. It's one of the features of Exploit Guard, I believe, or is it? I'm not sure if it's a different system. It basically restrains applications, and you can select which applications you want to allow to run on your systems. So, if you want to prevent unknown executables from running on your system, you can do that. Then, Exploit Guard is basically a batch of multiple countermeasures, which includes the attack surface reduction rules, which allows restricting applications and restricting capabilities in, for example, Microsoft Office. So macro-enabled documents have been used historically to deliver malware, and all of these techniques for delivering malware rely on certain behaviors, and you can restrict these behaviors with the attack surface reduction rules and make sure that even if an end user in your network receives one of these malware documents, it just cannot execute. So, as you can imagine, this all makes it difficult. So that means also that our job is made difficult as threat teamers, that we have to get initial access to phishing, we have to consider all of these problems and find ways to bypass them. So threat actors had a different idea. They decided to go for lower hanging fruit. RDP. So a very convenient protocol, remote desktop, which allows you to access other systems at a distance. That rhymes. So what threat actors do is they try to find exposed RDP ports out on the internet, and then there's a few possibilities here. So they can try to brute force credentials, they can try to find some leaked credentials, for example, and try to use those in the RDP port, or they can try to find vulnerabilities. There were some vulnerabilities that came out in remote desktop, such as the Bluekeep vulnerability, which was a memory corruption, which allowed you to basically execute code on the system remotely. Or the easiest way was basically to just purchase access from access brokers such as Xdedic. So Xdedic basically was a website where access brokers can sell access to other networks. And sometimes this was going for as low as $6. So for $6, you can buy access to a corporate network, and you have to do the lateral movement phase yourself as a threat actor and deploy ransomware. So that's a very convenient, very easy way to gain access to a network. And luckily, it has been shut down by the FBI, so don't go looking for it to deploy a ransomware. It's not going to work. Now, once they gain access to the network, as I said, like, you still have to do the initial access, the lateral movement phase yourself, and you start out, well, with network discovery. Start running port scans, like Trinity. And, have to identify the attack surface, have to find some vulnerable services maybe. And then, you want to use some lateral movement techniques. For example, PSExec. PSExec is a very convenient tool used by administrators to execute tasks remotely, and it's very loved by ransomware operators. They also like to use the Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMIC. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. VMIC, WMIC. I don't think there's consensus on this. And so these are the two main lateral movement techniques for threat actors. Then they also like to dump the LSAS memory process. So LSAS.exe contains credentials on a Windows system. This is because of the fact that Windows authentication mechanisms are flawed, but we're not going to get into that. Basically, their favorite method of doing this is either a proc dump, a tool from sysinternals, or also they can use the com svcs DLL, which is already on the system, and basically dump the memory with this. And then, when it comes to privilege escalation, this is what they want to do. They love zero logon, log4 shell, print nightmare, basically all of those vulnerabilities that enable you to escalate your privileges within a domain. So, the problem is that not all networks in which we do red teaming engagements it's possible to do these techniques. So this is all due to different security maturity. So normally ransomware operators go for, let's say, the low-hanging fruit. They go for the less mature networks. And in less mature networks, they can practice these techniques. They can use PSExec to do lateral movement. They can use zero log on the domain controllers because they are unpatched. And the problem is that these organizations that are in this situation don't really do red teaming most of the time. And that's why they are in that situation in the first place. However, the networks in which we have to run red teaming engagements have already done vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. They have patched most of the time the vulnerabilities that threat actors normally use. They've set up detection rules to detect PSExec usage. So we get in a dilemma as threat teamers. How are you supposed to simulate a threat actor which is targeting less secure networks with the same techniques and do that in a highly secure network? So there's not a lot of consensus on this. Some people think that we should keep doing these techniques because that's what we're asked to do. However, what's the point of running PSExec in a network if you know it's going to be detected? So this is also going to change in the near future, and especially with the DORA Act, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which the European Union is implementing to raise the security maturity of organizations. So we expect that thanks to this, the security maturity of many organizations is going to increase. So let's take a look at some classic differences in the techniques, what threat actors do and what red teamers do. So we're talking about a red team operator that's in a, let's say, reasonably secure environment that has implemented some detection and monitoring, and a threat actor with their standard targets. So ransomware operators love to use net commands. And I understand they are very convenient, very useful commands that you can use to discover a lot of information about the network shares, for example, or the users in the domain or whatever. So they also like to use cmd.exe, they love to use PowerShell, and so forth. The problem is that all of these commands create new processes. And the creation of new processes is something that defenders can look for to find out for malicious behaviors. So what we do when we red team is instead we call Windows 32 APIs within the same process. With that, you collect the same information, but you do not create new processes. So the new process creation, which is a great opportunity for detection for defenders, never happens, and you still acquire the same information. And in terms of defenses, what threat actors like to do, mostly ransomware operators, is to just disable them, kill the process. And you can do this with, for example, netsh to change the firewall rules. You can change, for example, registry values. And you can also use the set MP preference to modify defender behavior, and so forth. Some of these are applicable to mature client environments, but some of them are not. Because killing a defender process is a pretty big red flag for a defender. That doesn't normally happen, and when it happens, it stands out. So they will definitely look into why is the process not running anymore. What you can do is load a vulnerable driver, and from there, limit the capabilities of the defensive process. And with that, the process still remains. From the blue teamer's perspective, everything is perfectly fine. From the defensive product's perspective, for example, Defender, everything is perfectly fine. And the process is running. However, its functioning is being impeded. Threat actors like to execute commands on compromised systems, and understandable, sometimes that's necessary, especially when you do some local system discovery, when you enumerate the system, when you search for files on the system or whatever. However, this, of course, means that there's some kind of defensive software that's looking at you. It's scrutinizing every action that you do. And what I personally like to do is to proxy my traffic through an agent. So I try to execute as little as possible on the system when there's EDR running. I just open a proxy in memory and I proxy all my traffic through that agent. This way, the EDR doesn't have a clue about what's happening. Then, lateral movement, a necessary phase in pretty much every red team engagement or threat actor operation. So, threat actors like to use PSExec. And we did use PSExec, I guess, back in the days. But these days, unless the organization is using PSExec themselves, chances are this is immediately going to trigger alerts. And we know this, so we don't run PSExec. They also like to use the wmic/node command to execute commands through WMI remotely. And also they like RDP. So for RDP, I'm going to give that one to them. It's a great one. However, WMIC, not so much. So what I prefer to do myself is just stick to RDP strictly whenever possible. And there are some other techniques, like, for example, WMI event subscriptions, which is still using the WMI, the Windows Management Instrumentation interface. However, in a different way. And another popular lateral movement technique, which still seems to be pretty OPSEC safe these days, is changing the service binary through SCM. So a lot of lateral movement techniques back in the days were relying on, like, using the service control manager, like PSExec, for example, to create a new service. And this is extremely detectable. So the creation of a new service is a very scrutinized process in Windows. However, changing the service binary currently, for the time being, is pretty stealthy. Of course, this may vary between different networks, depending on what they are looking for, what kind of rules they have in their network. But in general, it is a pretty safe way to execute something in a lateral movement phase. So, what does all this mean? If the security maturity of organizations goes up, can we expect for ransomware operators to change the modus operandi to reflect more those of red team operators? So, what is the thing that has the highest impact on all of these techniques? Let's see. So, I think, based on what we see, is that red team operators are already simulating the adversaries of the future. So, threat actors, such as ransomware operators, are currently one step behind. Of course, we're not talking about modern-day espionage actors. They have to also practice this kind of OPSEC-safe techniques to make sure that they are undetected in their networks. However, as I mentioned, most organizations are concerned about ransomware operators. They do not care as much about the espionage actors. So I think it's reasonable to expect that when the general security maturity across organizations increases, that ransomware operators are also going to have to start employing the red team tactics of today. Now, if we have to choose one thing that impacts these developments the most, what would it be? Initial access. So the initial access phase is the phase that takes the most effort, the most stress, the most resources. And it is a very vulnerable time for both a threat actor and a red teamer, because you could spend weeks developing your malware, evading antivirus, making sure that everything works stealthily and well. And then something goes wrong and all those weeks of effort gone. So that's why Microsoft decided to focus a lot of hardening efforts on the initial access phase. And that's why employee workstations these days are pretty well hardened. I mean, not in every organization, but if an organization wants to defend against ransomware operators, they have a lot of built-in options from Windows, from the operating system, that they can enable and mitigate a lot of the threats from today. So what is an easier alternative for the threat actors? Because they're going to have to adapt. And as, of course, the maturity of organizations goes up and they can't find exposed RDP ports anymore out there, well, they're going to have to phish. Or maybe they can resort to other attacks. So what can we expect to see in the future? I have to preface it that this is my personal view on how things will develop into the future. But I think that supply chain attacks are going to become a lot more popular in the future. So, one organization's security is only as strong as its weakest link. And what if the weakest link is your supply chain? Many organizations, especially large networks, they have some forgotten random systems out there in the network that are not included in any system inventory. They're running some questionable software because someone had to install some suspicious driver for their Bluetooth headset from 2010. And it's also a Windows XP machine that nobody knows about. And whenever one of these, let's say, software packages running on the system gets compromised, a malicious update comes in, and then all of those efforts, all of those initial access mitigations that are supposed to prevent phishing on a user workstations, mark of the web, attack surface reduction, all of that becomes irrelevant because a lot of organizations do not even run EDR systems on servers. So if you compromise a server package and you pull a malicious update, chances are you're going to be able to compromise a lot of networks without detection. The only problem is that you cannot easily target organizations with this method as a threat actor because, of course, you don't always know 100% sure which organizations are running that software, but I don't think they care. Another popular attack vector, which the statistics show is increasing in recent days, is voice phishing. So humans tend to trust, once you hear someone on the phone and you hear their voice, you are more inclined to trust what they're saying, especially if they sound like they know what they're talking about. So you can call an unsuspecting user, tell them that you're from the IT support team and that they need to install this software package. Chances are they're going to do it. And threat actors have learned about this. So now they've started practicing voice phishing as one of their initial access vectors. Then physical attack vectors. There's already an increase in compromises that come from physical attack vectors. Mandiant has observed threefold increase in USB attacks in the past years. And this is because, once again, the USB is sort of seen as a trusted device by a system, and it's pretty simple to just send a bunch of mail with some USBs that have some very alluring content on them that induces users into clicking it. And of course, it had to be mentioned at least once in a presentation, artificial intelligence. So it's becoming less and less of a buzzword these days because we see a lot more practical applications of artificial intelligence, and it can help threat actors. It can help build their emails. And maybe before they had to type out their emails and make some very obvious spelling mistakes and typos. Now artificial intelligence can help them to write beautiful emails. They can generate content for their phishing infrastructure. They can also generate tooling that automates their tasks. So it has a lot of potential. However, it's yeah, it's still something that's under development, and we don't really know yet the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on this industry. So what does this mean for the future of society? Are we exerting evolutionary pressure for adversaries to become better and better and stealthier? We are. It's a fact that once the low-hanging fruit is over, they're gonna have to get better, and the ransomware operators that can't are just gonna get out of the game. And the ones that stay, they're gonna have to employ more and more advanced techniques to get to their targets. However, it also means that our defenses are getting better. And as much as I love to see that, it does make my job harder. I have to put a lot more effort into my initial access campaigns, but I'm very fine with that. It's exactly what's the point of our job, to increase the security maturity of organizations, and at the expense of our efforts, well, I'm willing to make that sacrifice. So, it's true, adversaries are going to evolve, but so are the defenses that are going to keep us safe. Thank you. Questions? Yes? Yeah. So the question is, are our red team tactics going to evolve in the future as well? So they have to. That's the answer to the question. They will definitely have to evolve because the defenses are evolving. So things change from day to day, and the techniques that we use all the time just do not work the next day. For example, dropping an ISO used to be a very convenient technique where you can just put your malware on the ISO and then it runs very nicely without the mark of the web. However, that's been now patched by Microsoft. So this is a change that happens from one day to another. And these small steps in tactics happen all the time. And the bigger leaps, I guess, we have to see how that happens because I cannot foresee how the bigger, let's say, changes are going to happen. I can say that I don't see us performing supply chain attacks at this point. We're going to have to, of course, start simulating more supply chain compromises, because I think most of the time red team exercises are about simulating a threat actor that got access to a workstation, for example, with phishing. And this is something that I expect will happen more in the future, that we are going to be simulating more threat actors from the perspective of like a compromised software package, for example. And when it comes to voice phishing, for example, that's also something that we are already doing in our red teams. Because we do see that there's a lot of North Korean groups, for example, that practice voice phishing, and we now feel comfortable that this is something that organizations need to learn to defend against. And of course, we do use AI in trying to automate some of the work, like to generate some content. So we are applying all of those techniques already in our tactics. So when it comes to physical access, we don't often get engagements where the client wants us to simulate physical access. However, when we do, there are some countermeasures that are meant to prevent this. For example, network access control. And there are ways to even subvert network access control. So we try to use this kind of techniques, for example, by using FuntUp when you know that you're going into a network that has network access control. And do them like that. We haven't been sending many USBs these days, but that's definitely something I'm willing to do on my next red team, hopefully soon. And yeah. Interesting question. Will red teams diverge from threat actors, or will they converge? So right now we definitely see divergence, and that's because the profile of threat actors that clients are concerned about, transformer operators, they do, as I mentioned, the security maturity of the clients makes a big difference in what you are able to do, what makes sense to do. Because obviously, if you run PSExec at the first day and get detected, what's the point in that? I do think that in the future, the threat actors will converge more towards our tactics because they will have to. Evolutionary pressure is going to force them to employ these tactics. And unless the threat profiles in general change, something new overtakes ransomware, which I don't see it happening because so far it seems to be very effective for threat actors. I feel like for now, it's going to keep on the convergence. Yeah. So it's true that you cannot always evaluate the security maturity. Sometimes you think you're in a secure environment, but it turns out that the client wasn't really ready for those advanced tactics that you're employing. And in those cases, we always we start out slow. We try to evaluate if they are at a sufficient security maturity level. And if it turns out that the client is not mature for those tactics, we always go a bit lower. So we try to employ some more detectable tactics such as PSExec, and sometimes as far as dropping mimicuts on a domain controller, and sometimes even that goes undetected. But we definitely try to adopt, because we try to trigger detection in our red teams always, because we do want to measure response and also the detection. So I think that educating users can only go as far in terms of educating against supply chain attacks. I think that these are technical measures that should prevent these attacks from being a problem in the first place. So if you mentioned dependency confusion, this is something that should be remediated on the side of the package manager instead of behavior, because it is something that is solvable. And I'm not sure why this is still a problem when it is something that can be solved. So my vote always goes for technical measures as opposed to behavior-based mitigations, because you cannot keep training the people all the time. People will leave the organization, new people will come, and then you have to do the trainings again. Whereas if you have a secure environment, then regardless of the behavior of the users, you will have a secure environment. Well, I guess just bringing attention to the issue, showing examples of how can be exploited is a good way to bring light to the issue. I think risk is a very abstract term for many. And if you don't show organizations and people how risks can be effectively exploited, they will not feel inclined to invest in mitigating those risks. So my vote goes for demonstrating impact. That is a whole different beast. And it's, so it's very interesting because, So the question is, what about OT? And this is all applicable to IT environments, what I mentioned. And in OT environments, things are in general very different. So when we do red teaming engagements in OT environments, most of the time our objectives are up to, let's say, the the privileged access workstation, accessing the privileged access workstation, and then you know that from that point on, you have unrestrained access to the OT environment. And from experience, the best way to mitigate OT problems is segment all that away, far away from civilization, because there is no way to defend it, and there always will be PLCs and all sorts of things running that are from prehistoric era, and there's no way to change that. Maybe in the future, for newly deployed OT networks, we can, of course, think about having a better security implemented, but for now, segmentation seems to be the way that OT networks are defended, and just even looking at a PLC can make it crash. So we generally don't go inside of the OT network. We just demonstrate the impact up to the OT network, and then from that point on, it's, well, it's too dangerous. So, will it be a target for the ransomware groups? Not sure if it would be a target for the ransomware groups, because I don't think they care as much about OT for now, but in the future, it could become more attractive. But I do see OT as being more of a target for geopolitical purposes. And given the climate in the world right now, OT networks could become a target of let's say, APTs that are associated with certain nation states. But yeah, it could, I guess, give ransomware operators more leverage if they can manage to deploy ransomware in an OT network, because, well, the operator will, of the OT grid is going to have to, of the OT network is going to have to pay that ransom to continue operating. So it's definitely something that could happen. Is there something you should avoid when implementing segmentation? So, segmentation can also break things. And I guess that's what your question is about. I'm not that skilled in deploying networks. I do have background as a network engineer, but most of the networks I've made have been in packet tracer. And I'm not familiar with what kind of problems there could arise with implementing segmentation. I think you should just be following some general rules about what kind of traffic is expected and is supposed to go here and there. And as long as you make sure it's the basic operations, the important things are allowed to work, then I think that's good.